This is Rick Kasalj from exercisesforinjuries.com. Today I have another interview for you, and what it is, it's on adrenal fatigue. And it's going to be with Joel, and I'll get Joel to introduce himself and share a bit of his story of adrenal fatigue. So Joel, I'll get you to introduce yourself.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Rick. So my name's Joel Rosen. I originally was born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, another Canuck. And I actually became a chiropractor after I had my first back injury. My parents are from a traditional medical family. My sister's a primary care doc, and my uncle's a dermatologist. And so it was really pushed for me to go for surgery. And after I injured my back. And so I had just graduated with an exercise physiology degree, and I thought there's no way that I'm going to go for surgery. I know how to rehab this myself. So someone introduced me to a chiropractor at the Canadian Memorial Chiropractic College, and it was like an epiphany. It was like, oh, that's what I want to do. So I ended up going to school in California. And in the process, I indebted myself over $150,000 worth of student loans in American funds. And right about the time that I had graduated, my wife was pregnant with twins. And so we decided we wanted to move to Florida because it was warm, it was still on the East Coast, and it was relatively easy to travel to and from Toronto. And so we did that. So we moved to Florida not knowing a single soul. And my wife was about 4 weeks pregnant, and she had to go on bed rest. She had a major problem where we could have lost the twins. And so being on bed rest, moving to Florida, having over $150,000 worth of student loans, not knowing anyone, I was just exhausted with stress. And so I injured my back again, another time exercising, and I had a patient come in and started my own practice. He was an acupuncturist, and he brought a book into me. It was called Why Do I Still Have Thyroid Symptoms Even Though My Blood Tests Are Normal? And I thought, what on earth are you bringing this in for me? I mean, this has nothing to do with me. So I just kind of let it sit on my desk at home, and something was pulling me towards it. It just kind of called my name every time I walked by it. And so I opened it up, and it was, again, another epiphany. It talked about the adrenal glands. And here I was, a doctor. I had 2 undergraduate degrees, one in exercise physiology, one in psychology, and I had never even heard of adrenal fatigue, yet I was living it. I was exhausted, I was stressed, I couldn't sleep, I was wired and tired, I had anxiety, I would get shaky, lightheaded, and jittery. If I hadn't had a meal, my blood sugar didn't stay stable all the time, and it was like, how come I don't know about this, and why, what's the story? So ever since then, Rick, it was just a path to A, heal myself, because I had mouths to feed and bills to pay, and then B, to be able to get the energy back to be able to do all of that. So I started this journey of learning all about the ins and outs of adrenal fatigue and how to rehabilitate myself. And pretty much now my practice is no longer musculoskeletally based practice where someone hurts their back. My practice is patients that are exhausted, that have chronic fatigue, that have fibromyalgia, autoimmunities, gastrointestinal problems. And the one underlining theme that all of these people have is adrenal gland problems. And so there's where we are, and here's what I'm doing now.
Amazing intro. Okay, so then maybe we can just kind of step back and go to the start. As you were saying, even with all of your experience and schooling, you didn't even know what was adrenal fatigue. So you can kind of explain to people, like, what is adrenal fatigue?
Sure. So Hans Selye, another Canadian-based researcher, plug for Canada, he is considered the father of stress theory. And so he had this theory that illness is just a generalized response to physiological changes. It's a generalized response. And he was shunned. He was shunned by his peers because they thought, how ridiculous could you think that, we're becoming more specialty, but yet you're trying to say there's a generalized response. And really after a lot of research research, it has been shown that there is a generalized response where when we have a stressor, whether it's a physical stressor, a mental stressor, emotional stressor, the way I explain it to my patients is just think of it like a meat grinder. And you could have pork and chicken and different types of meat. Those are the different stressors that when your body is stimulated with stressors, it mounts a stress response. And that stress response is perceived in the brain by the hypothalamus, and it sends a signal to the pituitary, and then the pituitary sends a signal to the adrenal glands and says, hey, you got to settle down. I always use the example of someone holding you up at gunpoint. Awful example, but just imagine that adrenaline rush. So that adrenaline rush is instantaneous. It's a neurological signal from the brain to the adrenals. Then the blood signal gets sent, and hormones are released. And so the adrenals are thought of like the clutch of a car, and it has to downshift or get you shifted back into not hyperventilating, getting your pulse rate down. So basically, in a nutshell, the adrenal gland response is a response to stress to be able to normalize your body and be able to deal effectively. That's pretty much what adrenal gland response is.
Okay, and that kind of leads into like how does one end up getting adrenal fatigue? So that how does that balance end up getting out of whack?
Right. So there's a lot of controversy with the term adrenal fatigue, which we can talk about. But basically what happens is that continued chronic response starts to break down mechanisms of that hypothalamus, that pituitary, that adrenal axis. So I'm a big analogy guy. The analogy I use is imagine it's hot in the house all the time, and the thermostat has to sense that change in temperature, and it kicks in and blows some cold air, or vice versa. It's always cold in the house. It gets feedback that it's cold in there, and it has to kick in and put in some hot air. That feedback loop gets broken with repetitive usage. And unfortunately, the traditional way that we test for adrenal gland problems is not really assessing that feedback loop. It's just looking at if we stimulate the adrenal glands, will they mount a response? And if they do, then it's not considered adrenal fatigue. And if they don't, then that's the medical definition of adrenal fatigue. So you have a lot of shades of gray, unfortunately. And because a lot of traditional medicines, doctors don't really look at the shades of gray, it's not within their algorithm to do that. A lot of people continue to suffer with feedback loop problems, with sensitivity to the hormone, so it allows the hormone into the cell to act and work properly. Other impact on inflammation, because really the adrenal glands are like the firemen of the body. If they're not able to put out the fires, then we're going to be chronically inflamed. And so that's kind of a long answer to your short question there.
Okay, so then looking at the traditional medicine way of assessing adrenal fatigue, then what would be another way, or the way that you recommend to get an idea if your adrenals are out of whack, or if you have adrenal fatigue?
Sure. Well, the best way, I mean, we always say like a gold standard way. If someone has a back injury, and the gold standard is to have an MRI and check out the musculoskeletal injury. So I would say that I've come a long way in my own journey, and as well as my patient's journey. And so my research has showed me now that the really the best way to get an accurate gold standard diagnosis, and for sure a lot of the medical establishment may disagree with me, is to look at it's called a dried urine total cortisol test. And so basically what it's doing is it's taking into consideration the circadian rhythm. So for example, we should have a lot of energy in the morning. We should jump out of the bed, spring off the pillow, have energy sustained throughout the entire day, and then by the time the nighttime comes, we hit the pillow like a baby and we fall asleep. That's ideal. But how many people have that actual ideal circadian rhythm? We don't. So our cortisol, or what our adrenal secretes, is also based on that circadian rhythm. So we need to see or assess is someone having nice responding high levels of cortisol in the morning and low levels in the evening. So when we do a blood test, or when the traditional doctor does a blood test in the morning, the ranges are a little broad because they compare those ranges to what the normal population would be. And unfortunately, the normal population is getting sicker and sicker. So when we're compared to the normal population, just because we're not as sick as them doesn't necessarily mean we're healthy. So that's the first flaw. The second flaw is when we do a morning time sample, we don't look at the middle of the day, the end of the day, and any time in between. So that's why we want to have more of a reflection of the circadian rhythm. Where you do a urinary test, the test is done at dinner time. So your dinner time may be different than my dinner time. So that's what's great about that test. Then you do it at bedtime. And again, your bedtime may be different from my bedtime, especially with people that have that third watch type of job. And then you do it upon rising, and then you do it 2 hours later. So that way you can get a better reflection of how the circadian rhythm of your cortisol is pumping out. And then lastly, what's so good about the urinary cortisol hormone test is that you can look at the metabolites. And so basically the metabolites are the hormones that have been broken down, or they're downstream from the upstream hormones that are being utilized. Because if you don't see the way that they're breaking down, and I again use analogies as you'll see, in Price is Right, you have Plinko where you drop the chip and then it kind of goes down one way. That's how metabolites are. And so you can get fixated in an acute or chronic stress response to go down the wrong way. And so if you're only doing a blood test in the morning, you're not looking at, we just mentioned the circadian rhythms, but you're also not looking at the Plinko chips and how they're falling down in a certain way. And that gives you a lot of clinical usefulness when you're trying to help someone who's exhausted, burnt out, anxious, not being able to focus, shaky and lightheaded, and their doctor tells them, hey, there's no such thing as adrenal fatigue. So, yeah.
Okay. Now, okay. Interesting test, comprehensive test.